The smell of burnt stew filled the small, dimly lit kitchen. A plate crashed to the floor, pieces of the shattered ceramic scattered like a broken promise. Lena's lip trembled as she stared at the mess, her pale blue eyes filling with unshed tears. "I miss Mama's cooking," she whispered, barely audible over the silence that hung thick in the air. The words, simple and true, pierced Samuel's heart. It had been 8 long months since Catherine's death, and every day felt heavier than the last. No matter how hard he tried, nothing seemed to be right anymore. He glanced at the stove, the once familiar rhythm of family life, now replaced by chaos. The ranch was struggling, his efforts futile as the land didn't yield the way it used to. And Lena, his precious little girl, no longer smiled at the dinner table. She cried, ate little, and stared at the empty seat where her mother once sat. Samuel's heart ached, knowing that he wasn't just losing the ranch. He was losing his daughter too. Moses, the old ranch hand, had suggested more than once that Samuel hire someone to help. But each time, Samuel resisted. He couldn't shake the worry of what the town would say. The town was small, and word traveled fast. Hiring a widow to cook for his family might raise more than a few eyebrows. What would people think of him? Of Lena? He couldn't bear the thought. As Samuel stood, staring at the stew still simmering, he heard a knock at the door. He wiped a hand across his forehead and made his way to the door, his mind distracted by 1,000 thoughts. When he opened it, there stood a woman with a large carpet bag in her hand. Her face was soft but weathered, eyes weary but kind. "I'm Abigail Porter," she said, her voice steady yet tinged with something unreadable. "I'm here about the job." Samuel froze, unsure of what to say. "The job," he repeated, his brow furrowing. "I didn't post a job." Abigail stepped forward, her eyes scanning the interior of the house. "I've been hearing about the troubles at the Hayes Ranch," she said. "I can help. I know how to cook, clean, and tend to a home." Samuel hesitated. There was something in the way she spoke, clear and direct, that put him at ease. Yet, the thought of hiring a widow to care for his home, especially after Catherine's death, felt too complicated, too risky. "I'm afraid I don't," he began, but she interrupted. "I understand your concerns," Abigail said quietly, "but I know how to keep a home. Your daughter needs someone who can provide more than just food. I can offer that, but I need 2 weeks to prove myself. If you don't like what I do, then I'll leave." Samuel opened his mouth to argue, but Lena's small voice stopped him. She had been standing at the door, watching from the shadows. "Papa, please," she said, tugging at his sleeve. "Please let her stay. I don't want you to cook anymore. I want her to cook. She can make food like Mama did." Samuel's heart squeezed in his chest. His little girl was asking for something he wasn't sure he could give. He glanced down at Lena, her hopeful face framed by the doorway. 2 weeks, he finally said, his voice low and uncertain. "That's all I can offer." Abigail nodded, her gaze softening. 2 weeks it is," she said, stepping inside. That evening, Abigail took charge of the kitchen, her hands moving with purpose. She surveyed the chaos in the room, a stack of dirty dishes, the stove caked with old food, then turned her focus to the task at hand. She didn't seem overwhelmed or intimidated. She went to work, gathering ingredients, setting the table, and bringing a calm, focused energy to the space. As the evening drew on, the scent of fresh stew and warm biscuits filled the air. Lena hovered nearby, her eyes wide as she watched Abigail work. "Is it ready yet?" Lena asked eagerly, unable to contain her excitement. Abigail smiled. "Almost, sweetheart. Why don't you set the table while I finish up here?" Lena darted around the room, eager to help. It was the first time in months that Samuel saw a spark of joy in her eyes. The warmth in the room, the soft glow of the oil lamps, and the sound of Abigail humming as she cooked, everything felt different. For the first time in a long while, Samuel didn't feel so lost. Finally, dinner was ready. Abigail served the stew with a generous scoop of fresh biscuits, and Samuel took a seat at the table. Lena was the first to dig in, taking a small bite of the stew. Her eyes lit up, and she gasped. "It tastes like happy," she said, her voice full of wonder. Samuel watched as his daughter laughed, the sound ringing through the house like music. He hadn't heard that laugh in months. He glanced at Abigail, who was watching Lena with a soft smile on her face. Samuel couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this could work. That night, after the dishes were cleaned and the kitchen was quiet, Abigail headed to the small cabin behind the main house, where she would sleep for the night. As she made her way across the yard, she overheard Lena's voice, soft but clear. "Papa, can she stay forever?" Samuel stood frozen, caught between fear and longing. His heart felt like it was being torn in two. Could he allow himself to move on from Catherine's memory? Could he let Abigail stay, despite the whispers of the town and his own fears? The next morning, as Samuel began his day with the horses, a rider appeared on the path. It was Harmon, the town banker, and he had a scowl on his face. Samuel felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He knew what was coming. The town was small, and so were its expectations, but Samuel had no choice but to meet them head on. The first week with Abigail had brought a change Samuel never imagined. The ranch, once grim and silent, had transformed. The kitchen was no longer a battlefield. It was a place of comfort and warmth, where Lena learned to bake, and the aroma of freshly baked bread and biscuits filled the house every morning. Flowers adorned the table. The curtains were clean, and there was a rhythm to the days that had been missing since Catherine passed. Lena had found her voice again, singing while she helped, her laughter echoing in the corners of the house. Samuel woke to fresh coffee every morning, a rare luxury that made his long rides to the fields a little easier to face. He would come home to find his shirt mended, the fire lit, and the house full of life. Despite the visible change, however, the tension remained, lingering just beneath the surface. Samuel found himself watching Abigail more often than he cared to admit, drawn to her quiet strength and the kindness she showed to Lena. Their nightly conversations after Lena went to bed were healing for both of them. Two people who had lost so much, now tentatively finding comfort in each other's company. But Samuel was conflicted. He knew the town was watching, and they weren't kind to outsiders, especially widows. He could feel the whispers even in the air. One day, while Samuel took Lena to the town store for supplies, he felt it. The cold stares, the pointed whispers. The town was talking, and not in a way that brought him peace. Mrs. Harmon's disapproval was loud enough for everyone to hear, and Samuel felt a tightness in his chest as he realized the price of his decisions. Lena, oblivious to the tension, spoke out loud in her innocent joy. "Miss Abigail makes Papa smile again," she said, her voice carrying across the room. Reverend Collins, always the voice of judgment, caught Samuel's eye, his frown deepening. When they returned to the ranch, the sight of Abigail twirling Lena around in the kitchen, both of them laughing and dancing to a song Catherine once sang, broke Samuel's heart. Lena, caught up in the moment, beamed. "Look, Papa, Miss Abigail knows Mama's favorite song." The joy in her voice cut through the air like a knife, leaving Samuel to wrestle with his guilt. The happiness that filled the house felt foreign and beautiful, yet it left him aching with the thought of Catherine. As the days wore on, Samuel's internal war deepened. He wanted his daughter to be happy, but the weight of his past and the town's judgment pressed down on him. One morning, as he stood on the porch, hearing the laughter of his daughter and Abigail inside, Moses came to stand beside him. "That's the sound of healing, son," Moses said softly, but Samuel wasn't so sure. That very evening, Lena came home from school in tears, her face streaked with red. Samuel's heart sank as she ran to him, sobbing uncontrollably, her cries more painful than anything he had heard in months. The world outside had already begun to take its toll, and Samuel knew it was only going to get harder. The weight of cruelty can be hardest to bear for those who are most innocent. Lena, only 8, had never known the full scope of the world's harshness until that fateful day at school. As soon as she walked through the door, Samuel could tell something was wrong. Her eyes were red, her lower lip trembling. She dropped her school bag by the door and ran to him, clinging to his leg. "Papa," she whispered, her voice breaking, "the girls at school said bad things about Miss Abigail." Samuel froze, the familiar pang of guilt coursing through him. He had known this moment would come. The town's cruel whispers had to eventually reach Lena's ears. He knelt down, looking in her eyes, and asked gently, "What did they say, sweetheart?" Lena's voice quivered as she spoke. They said Miss Abigail is like a bad lady, like a mistress." The words stung like thorns, and Samuel felt his stomach twist with a sickening sense of dread. It wasn't the first time he had heard the cruel talk behind his back, but hearing it directed at his daughter was a different kind of agony. Lena didn't fully understand the weight of the words, but she knew enough to feel the sting. She had trusted Miss Abigail, had come to see her as a source of comfort and care. The idea that someone could call Abigail something so terrible, something that made her feel like she wasn't welcome in their home, was almost too much for Lena to comprehend. "Are you a bad lady, Miss Abigail?" Lena asked, her voice small and fragile, a question that twisted inside Samuel's chest. His breath caught in his throat. He had never wanted his daughter to see the world this way, but here she was, struggling to understand the cruelty of those who whispered and judged without knowing the truth. Abigail, hearing the conversation from the doorway, stepped into the room, her face pale but composed. She kneeled beside Lena, gently brushing a tear from her cheek. "No, sweet girl," Abigail said softly, her voice full of warmth. "I'm not a bad lady. Some people say things they don't understand, but that doesn't make it true. I'm here because I care about you, and I care about your papa." Lena, still unsure, looked at Abigail with wide, confused eyes. But why would they say that? Why would they be mean? Abigail smiled gently, brushing a lock of hair from Lena's face. "Sometimes people say hurtful things because they're afraid, but that doesn't mean those words have to matter. What matters is what's inside, and what's inside me is love for you both." Lena's eyes softened as she absorbed the words, but Samuel could see the confusion still lingering. Abigail's presence had done wonders for Lena's heart, but the external world was threatening to rip that comfort apart. Samuel stood, clenching his fists at his sides. He wanted to go to the school and confront the children who had hurt Lena, but he knew that wouldn't fix anything. It would only make things worse. He wanted to protect his daughter, to shield her from the cruelty of the world, but he knew that was impossible. As he looked at Abigail, his guilt deepened. He had brought her into this, knowing full well that the town's judgment would fall on them both. And now, his daughter was feeling the consequences. The following weekend, the town's annual harvest social was held in the center of town, a time for families to come together and celebrate the fruits of their labor. It was a tradition that had existed for as long as anyone could remember, and even though Samuel was hesitant, he agreed to take Lena. She had begged him to bring Abigail along, and despite the awkwardness he knew would follow, he couldn't bear to see her disappointed. They arrived together, Abigail walking at Samuel's side, Lena skipping along ahead, her eyes bright with excitement. The usual bustle of the harvest social surrounded them. Women setting out pies and cakes, men tuning their fiddles, children running and laughing in the fields. But the moment they stepped onto the grounds, Samuel could feel the tension in the air. The cold shoulders, the sideways glances, it was all too familiar. He could feel the disapproving stares of the women, the murmurs of the men. It was as though the entire town was watching them, judging them. Lena, blissfully unaware, tugged at Abigail's hand, pulling her towards the apple pie contest. "Let's make a pie together, Miss Abigail," she said, her voice full of hope. Abigail smiled, but Samuel could see the strain behind her eyes. He He knew she had to be feeling the weight of the town's disapproval, even though she had never said a word about it. As they made their way to the pie station, Samuel couldn't help but overhear the whispers. Mrs. Harmon, as usual, had the loudest voice. "That Porter woman living with the Hayes family. It's just disgraceful," she said, her tone thick with judgment. Samuel's heart pounded in his chest, and he fought to keep his expression neutral. He wanted to tell Mrs. Harmon to keep her opinions to herself, but he didn't have the courage. He couldn't bring himself to cause a scene, not when Lena was so excited, so full of hope. Just then, a small miracle happened. Lena, beaming with pride, took her pie, made with Abigail, with love and care, and held it high, shouting to everyone, "Look, I helped Miss Abigail make this. We won the blue ribbon." The joy on her face was undeniable, pure, and innocent. But as the words left her mouth, Samuel caught the sharp, biting voice of Mrs. Harmon once again. "Pity about that child's situation," she muttered, her voice dripping with disdain. Samuel froze. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. The word was like a slap to his face, a reminder of how far his life had shifted from the ideal that society demanded. He had hoped that the Harvest Social would be a place of celebration, a place where they could be free of the harsh judgment of the town. But the truth was, the town's opinion weighed on him far more than he wanted to admit. And as Mrs. Harmon's words hung in the air, Samuel stood there, silent, as Lena's joy began to fade. The light in her eyes dimmed as she looked up at him, waiting for him to make things right. But he couldn't. He stood frozen in place, unable to defend them, unable to speak out against the cruelty that was slowly tearing their world apart. As they made their way home later that day, the silence between Samuel and Abigail was deafening. Lena chattered on about the ribbon, about the fun she'd had, but her excitement was tinged with sadness, a sadness Samuel could not ignore. He wanted to tell her it was all going to be okay, but he didn't have the words. He couldn't promise her that life would get better, that the cruelty would stop. And the worst part was, he knew it was his fault. That night, when they arrived back at the ranch, Abigail was quiet. She didn't say a word as she made her way to her cabin, leaving Samuel alone with his thoughts. He knew he had failed her, failed them both. And as the darkness crept in, Samuel realized that the price of his silence was a pain that no one could escape. The next morning, the weight of the previous day's events hung over the house like a dark cloud. Lena woke early, her bright eyes red from crying. She didn't say anything, just sat at the kitchen table, her small hands curled into tight fists. Samuel could feel the ache in her silence, the distance she had put between herself and the world. He knew it was his fault. The cruel words, the disapproving stares, had pierced through the shield of joy that Abigail had carefully built around their family. Lena had felt the sting of rejection, and now, even her smile seemed like a distant memory. Samuel walked into the kitchen, but when he tried to speak, the words caught in his throat. He had failed her. He had failed both of them. "Papa, are you mad at me?" Lena's soft voice broke the silence, and Samuel felt his heart twist in his chest. His little girl, so innocent, so full of life, now stood before him, unsure of everything, even her place in his world. He dropped to his knees in front of her, his hands shaking as he cupped her face. "No, sweet girl," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm not mad at you. I'm just so sorry." She looked at him, her big brown eyes filled with confusion and pain. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen, Lena. I never wanted you to feel hurt or alone." Her tiny lips trembled, and she whispered, "But why is Miss Abigail leaving, Papa? Why can't she stay?" Samuel closed his eyes, his heart heavy. He had tried so hard to keep his distance, to push Abigail away. But now the consequences of his inaction were breaking his daughter's heart. Abigail had brought light into their home, and now that light was flickering, fading under the weight of the town's judgment. "I don't know, sweetheart," Samuel said, his voice low and filled with regret. "I don't know if I can fix this. He knew he couldn't keep going like this. He couldn't let fear and guilt drive a wedge between him and his daughter. He couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. He had to do something. But what? He needed to protect Lena from the cruelty of the world, to shield her from the harsh realities of life that seemed to be closing in on them. But he didn't know how to fight back. He hadn't been brave enough. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the ranch, Samuel sat alone on the porch, his thoughts swirling like the wind around him. He thought about Catherine, his late wife, and how she had been the one to hold their family together. She had been the one who understood him, the one who knew how to make Lena laugh, even on the hardest days. And now, Catherine was gone, and Samuel had been left to pick up the pieces of a broken family. But he had failed. He had failed to protect them from the world. He had failed to give Lena the stability and love she needed. And now, Abigail was leaving. He couldn't let that happen. As he sat there, lost in his thoughts, Moses came to join him on the porch. The old ranch hand, who had seen more than his fair share of heartbreak, sat down beside him in silence. Moses didn't speak for a long time, and Samuel didn't push him to. They both knew there were no easy answers. But finally, Moses broke the silence. "You're wrestling demons, son," he said quietly. "I can see it in your eyes." Samuel didn't reply. He didn't have the words. He couldn't explain the heaviness in his chest, the guilt that weighed him down like a 100-pound anchor. "You're afraid," Moses continued, his voice steady. "Afraid of what the town will say. Afraid of what you've already lost." Samuel swallowed hard, his throat tight. "I'm not afraid of what they'll say, Moses," he replied, his voice rough. "I'm afraid of losing Lena. I'm afraid of her hating me, of her thinking I didn't do enough to protect her." Moses chuckled softly, though there was little humor in it. "You've got a good heart, Samuel," he said, "but you're protecting fear. You've been protecting fear ever since Catherine passed. And look where it's got you." Samuel looked at him, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" he asked. "What else am I supposed to protect?" Moses turned to face him, his weathered face softening. "You're protecting your image, son. You're protecting the ranch, the reputation, the expectations of the town. But what about your daughter? What about what she needs? What about her happiness?" Samuel's heart clenched. He knew Moses was right. All this time, he had been holding on to his fear, trying to keep everything perfect, trying to make sure nothing changed. But everything had changed, and it was time to let go of the fear that was holding him back. He had to do what was best for Lena, even if it meant going against the town, even if it meant confronting his own weaknesses. "What kind of man do you want Lena to see?" Moses asked, his voice gentle but firm. Samuel shook his head, the weight of the question pressing down on him. "I don't know," he admitted. "I don't know what kind of man I am anymore." Moses smiled, a rare and knowing smile. "You're a man who loves his daughter," he said simply. "You're a man who's lost his way, but you're still trying to find it. That's what matters." Samuel's chest tightened as Moses' words sank in. It was true. He had been lost, but he didn't have to stay lost. He could fight for his family, fight for the love he still had, even if it meant facing his fears. He had to be the man Lena needed. He couldn't keep running from his own heart. The next morning, Samuel found himself standing at the cemetery, staring at Catherine's grave. The wind had picked up, and the trees swayed in the breeze, their leaves rustling softly. He felt a sense of peace here, despite the turmoil he had been feeling. This was where it all began. This was where he had promised Catherine he would always take care of their family. And now, he needed to make good on that promise. He dropped to his knees beside her grave, his hands trembling as he placed a bouquet of wildflowers on the ground. He spoke quietly, as though Catherine could hear him. "I need your permission to live again," he whispered, the words barely audible. The wind swirled around him, and for a brief moment he felt a sense of calm, a sense that Catherine's spirit was with him, guiding him. "I'll always love you," he said, his voice steady now. "But I choose to live. I choose to fight for Lena. I choose to fight for us." He stood slowly, the weight of his decision heavy but clear in his heart. He could no longer live in the shadows of his fear. He had to step into the light, to give his daughter the happiness she deserved. He turned and rode back toward the ranch with a new sense of purpose. As he approached the house, he saw Moses standing in the yard, waiting for him. "She's gone," Moses said quietly. Samuel's heart sank, his worst fear realized. "She left before dawn," Moses continued. "Stagecoach to Cheyenne." Samuel's chest tightened. He had failed. He had waited too long. But as he turned to go inside, Lena appeared, standing in the doorway, her eyes wide and hopeful. "Papa," she said softly, her voice filled with fear. "Did we lose her?" Samuel lifted his daughter into his arms, his heart heavy but resolute. "Not if I can help it," he said, his voice filled with determination. "Get dressed, Lena. We're going to find Miss Abigail." He knew it wouldn't be easy. The town, the judgment, it would all still be there. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that he had found his courage. He would fight for his family. He would fight for Abigail, for Lena, for the love they had. This time, he wouldn't let fear win. The chase began at dawn, as the first light of morning broke across the land, casting long shadows over the ranch. Samuel had barely slept the night before, his mind racing with the decision he had made. He had finally made up his mind. He would not let Abigail leave. He couldn't lose her, not after everything she had done for him, for Lena. He couldn't let fear control his life any longer. Lena, her bright eyes filled with hope, was already saddling the horses when Samuel arrived. She didn't ask where they were going. She didn't question him. She simply knew. It was as if they both understood that this was their last chance, the only chance they had left to make things right. Together, they rode hard, the horses' hooves pounding against the dirt road, the wind whipping through their hair. As they neared the town, Samuel could feel the tension in his chest tighten, the weight of the upcoming confrontation pressing down on him. The town, with all its whispers, its judgment, was not an easy place to face, especially when it comes to something as personal as Abigail. But Samuel knew he had to do this. He had to stand up for her, for Lena, and for the life he wanted to build. The town square was bustling with activity when they arrived, the church bells ringing in the distance, signaling the beginning of the Sunday service. The people were gathering, just as they always did, for the weekly community meeting. Abigail was there, standing outside the stage depot, her carpet bag by her side, ready to leave. The sight of her, standing there alone, broke Samuel's heart. He had taken too long, waited too long, and now she was about to leave. She turned when she saw them, her eyes sad but resolute. She had made her decision, and no matter how much Samuel wanted to stop her, he knew she was determined. She had always been the stronger one, the one who did what needed to be done, no matter the cost. Samuel's heart ached as he dismounted, his feet heavy as he walked toward her. But before he could say anything, Moses appeared at his side, a knowing look in his eyes. "They're talking about her in there," Moses said, nodding toward the meeting hall. "You should hear what they're saying, Samuel. It's not good." Samuel hesitated. He had heard the whispers before, but this was different. This was the moment that could change everything. He could go after Abigail, plead with her to stay, or he could go into the meeting and confront the town. He could stand up for what was right, for what he believed in. But he wasn't sure if he had the courage. "You need to hear this, son," Moses urged, placing a hand on his shoulder. Samuel looked at Moses, torn. He wanted to go to Abigail, to stop her from leaving, but he knew he couldn't let the town's opinion dictate his life any longer. "All right," Samuel said, his voice low but firm. "I'll go in." They walked together toward the meeting hall, the heavy door creaking open as they entered. The room fell silent as Samuel stepped inside, the eyes of the entire town turning toward him. He could feel the weight of their gaze, the judgment in their stares. The room was divided, some faces full of disapproval, others more neutral, but Samuel didn't care. He had made his decision. He had come here to speak his truth, no matter the cost. Reverend Collins was the first to speak. "Brother Hayes," he said, his voice dripping with condemnation, "we were discussing moral standards. And, well, it's come to our attention that your household arrangement is, well, less than respectable." Samuel's jaw clenched as he fought to keep his composure. He wanted to lash out, to tell them all that they had no right to judge him, to judge Abigail, but he didn't. He had to stay calm. He had to do this for Lena, for the future he wanted to build. "Your household is setting a poor example for the children of this town," Mrs. Harmon added, her voice loud and shrill. "It's a disgrace, Samuel. A woman like her, living in your house with no proper intentions. Were you teaching your daughter?" Samuel could feel the blood rushing to his face, the heat of embarrassment, of anger, threatening to consume him. But he stayed quiet. He needed to hear them out. He needed to know what they were going to say before he made his move. The banker, Harmon, spoke next. "The board has voted," he said coldly. "We can't renew your loan unless you make changes. The people of this town have spoken, and they don't approve of your situation. The way things are now, I can't support you, Samuel." The room filled with murmurs, the whispers growing louder as they spread across the hall. Samuel's hands tightened into fists, his heart racing. He had always feared this day would come, but now that it was here, he realized something. He didn't care about their approval. He didn't care about the loan or their judgment. What mattered was Lena. What mattered was Abigail. He had spent too long living in fear of what the town thought, but no more. This was his family, and he would protect them at all costs. He stood up straighter, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "You want to talk about morality?" Samuel said, his words clear and steady. "Let's talk about truth. My daughter has been grieving the loss of her mother, and in the process, she has been starving for love. This woman," he pointed to Abigail, "has saved her. She has brought my daughter back to life. She has given her something I couldn't give her. And if that's immoral, then I don't want any part of your morality." Samuel paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "Abigail works dawn to dusk, asks for nothing, and gives everything. She has made our home a place of laughter, a place of joy. If that's a crime, then so be it. I'll take that crime every day." He took a deep breath, his chest tight. "And if you think I'm going to let you take that away from me, you're wrong. I won't let you. I don't care about your loan. I don't care about your approval. What matters is my daughter, and what matters is the love we have in our home. My daughter said it best. She said, 'She fills our home with happiness, Papa.'" Samuel's voice cracked with emotion as he repeated the words. "That's worth more than all your approval." The room was silent. For a moment, Samuel thought he might have made a mistake, that he might have alienated everyone in the town. But then, something unexpected happened. Moses, standing at the back of the room, stepped forward. "I'll co-sign your loan, Samuel," he said, his voice strong and unwavering. "And I know I'm not the only one." One by one, the other ranchers and townsfolk began to speak up. "We'll co-sign too," said Rancher Thompson, a man Samuel had known for years. It's time someone spoke the truth. Another rancher stood, nodding. "Count me in," he said. And then another voice called out, "We've been waiting for someone to stand up for what's right." The room was slowly filling with support. Even Reverend Collins, though reluctant, stepped forward. "Perhaps I judged hastily," he said, his voice softer than before. "Maybe it's time I looked at things from a different perspective." Samuel, still holding Lena's hand, looked up at Abigail, who had tears streaming down her face. She didn't say anything, but her eyes spoke volumes. She had waited for him to find his courage, and now he had. But before Abigail could say anything, the church doors swung open, and Moses emerged, followed by the other ranchers and families who had rallied behind Samuel. The support was overwhelming. It was the moment Samuel had been waiting for, the moment when the town finally saw the truth. Lena, grinning from ear to ear, tugged at Abigail's dress. "See? They understand now," she said excitedly. Samuel looked at Abigail, his heart swelling. "Say yes," he whispered, his voice filled with hope. And Abigail, overcome with emotion, finally spoke. Yes, she said, tears of relief and joy streaming down her face. Yes, I'll stay. It wasn't just a promise to Samuel or to Lena. It was a declaration of their future, a future where love, not fear, would guide their lives. And as they walked out of the church together, Samuel knew one thing for certain. He had found his voice, and it had changed everything. The days that followed were a blur of joy and new beginnings. Abigail's decision to stay had breathed life back into the ranch, into their home, and into Samuel's heart. Lena, ever the optimist, was beside herself with happiness. She had seen it in her father's eyes, the shift, the change, the realization that life could be happy again. And she had seen it in Abigail's eyes, too. It was a moment of quiet, unspoken understanding between the three of them. The healing had begun, and they would face whatever came next together. The first few days after the meeting were full of small, tender moments. Samuel and Abigail, though still finding their way, began to grow into the roles they had chosen, roles that had been thrust upon them by the circumstances of the past months, but that they were now willing to embrace. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Samuel began to allow himself to feel hope. The ranch that had once seemed like a weight on his shoulders now seemed like a place where he could build a new life, one where his daughter and Abigail could thrive. Samuel found himself waking early, before the sun, with a sense of purpose he had long since lost. He would feed the horses, check the cattle, and then return to the house to find coffee waiting for him on the stove. Abigail's doing, of course. Lena would be in the kitchen, humming as she worked beside Abigail, learning the ways of the house, just as she had once learned from her mother. There was something about the way Abigail moved in the kitchen that made it feel like home again. She had a quiet grace, a confidence that came from experience, and a deep love for the family she had chosen to care for. Abigail had a way of making everything feel right, even when it wasn't. It was as if the house had come alive, and it was impossible not to feel it. For Lena, life was full of new discoveries. She had started baking with Abigail, learning the recipes that would one day belong to her, the same way she had learned them from her mother. The first time Lena baked a batch of biscuits on her own, she couldn't stop smiling. "Papa, look, I did it, just like Miss Abigail," she exclaimed, her face glowing with pride. Samuel couldn't help but laugh as he watched her, so full of joy and wonder. For so long, he had watched her mourn, seen her suffer in silence. But now, he saw her come to life again. Lena's laughter filled the house, and with it came a lightness that hadn't been there in months. The days turned into weeks, and, as the fall gave way to winter, their lives took on a new rhythm. Samuel and Abigail began to spend more time together, talking late into the night after Lena had gone to bed. They shared stories about their pasts, of lost loves, of regrets, of what it meant to be a parent. Samuel learned more about Abigail's life, her struggles, her losses. He learned that her decision to come to the ranch wasn't just about helping them. It was about healing herself, too. She had lost so much, just like him. And though she never spoke of it in front of Lena, Samuel could see the pain behind her eyes, a quiet sorrow that seemed to linger, even in the midst of the happiness they were building together. But Abigail was strong, and she didn't let her past define her. She was here now, with them, and that was what mattered. They began to form new traditions as a family. On Christmas Eve, Samuel found himself in the kitchen with Lena and Abigail, decorating cookies and hanging ornaments on the tree. The house, once dark and empty, was now filled with laughter and light. For the first time in years, Samuel felt the joy of the season. He could hear Lena singing carols in the next room, her voice bright and clear, and for a moment, it was as if Catherine was still there with them. In the quiet moments of the evening, Samuel took a seat beside Abigail, their hands brushing as they sat together, watching Lena. It felt like the world had shifted, like the weight of their past had been lifted. As the night went on, The warmth of the fire and the comfort of their family made everything seem possible. They were finally, truly together. As winter turned to spring, Samuel knew he had to take the next step. He had promised Abigail that he would fight for their future, that he would stand by her no matter what the town thought. And he meant it. The wedding, though small, was everything they had dreamed of. It was held under the cottonwood trees, where Samuel had once stood before Catherine's grave, making his promise to live again. The town was divided, of course. There were those who came to celebrate with them, and those who chose to stay away. But that didn't matter. What mattered was the love that Samuel and Abigail shared, and the love that had been rebuilt in their family. Lena, beaming with pride, was the flower girl, wearing a simple dress that Abigail had helped her pick out. She looked like an angel, her face glowing with happiness. The ceremony was short, but beautiful, and when Samuel and Abigail exchanged vows, it felt as if the world had finally fallen into place. As they walked down the aisle together, hand in hand, the crowd erupted into applause. Samuel's heart swelled as he looked at Abigail, his new wife. She had given him everything: hope, love, a future. He couldn't believe that he had almost let it slip away. That night, as the barn dance kicked off, Samuel and Abigail shared their first dance as husband and wife. Lena, now filled with joy, danced between them, her small hands in both of theirs. It was the happiest Samuel had felt in years. For the first time in a long while, he felt complete. He whispered to Abigail, his voice thick with emotion, "Thank you for not giving up on us." She smiled, her eyes filled with tears. "You found your voice, Samuel," she said softly. "I just waited to hear it." The weeks that followed were a blur of happiness. Samuel and Abigail spent their days working together, learning how to live as husband and wife, learning how to be a family. They weren't perfect. There were still struggles, still moments of doubt, but they were building something real, something that had once seemed impossible. By the time summer arrived, the ranch was thriving. The crops were coming in strong, the cattle were healthy, and the house was full of life. It wasn't just the ranch that was flourishing, it was their family. Lena had grown taller, her smile brighter, her heart lighter. And now, there was a new addition to their family. Abigail had given birth to a healthy baby boy, who they named James after Samuel's father. The baby, though still small, was already a source of joy for everyone. Lena couldn't wait to help with the baby, to teach him everything she had learned. Samuel had never imagined that his life could be this full, this complete. And yet, here he was, with his family, his heart finally at peace. That evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, Samuel looked at the faces before him. Lena, now 9, was showing her baby brother how to clap. Abigail, holding the baby in her arms, smiled at Samuel, her eyes soft with love. The house smelled of freshly baked pie, and the sound of laughter filled the air. Moses, as usual, had arrived for Sunday dinner, and there were extra chairs at the table now, because the family had grown. The love that filled the room was palpable, and Samuel felt a deep sense of gratitude wash over him. "How are my 3 favorite people?" he asked, his voice full of warmth. Lena, beaming, said, "I helped Mama Abigail make your favorite pie, Papa." Samuel smiled, his heart swelling with pride. He knew that he had found something worth fighting for. They were no longer just surviving, they were thriving. As the family sat together for grace, Samuel said a quiet prayer of thanks. "Thank you for second chances, for courage, for love," he prayed softly. And then Lena, her voice full of joy, added, "And thank you for bringing Mama Abigail to us." Samuel's eyes filled with tears as he looked around the table. This was everything he had ever wanted. This was his family, and they were complete. The baby gurgled in Abigail's arms, and the room erupted in laughter. It was a simple moment, but it was everything. As the camera pulled back from the window, the soft light from the kitchen spilling out into the yard, Samuel's voice, now strong and full of conviction, echoed in the background. They say home is four walls and a roof, he said. But I learned that home is where someone has the courage to fill your life with happiness, and where you find the courage to protect that happiness. The family was whole now, and the ranch, once a place of grief and loss, was a home filled with love and laughter. Samuel had found his courage, and in doing so, had built the life he had always dreamed of, a life where love was not hidden, but celebrated. As the camera pulled back even further, showing the house in its entirety, the flowers blooming around it, and the bright golden light spilling from the windows, it was clear. This was home, and it was full of happiness.